On a mild summer afternoon in July 1942, the manicured grounds of Harvard University became the unlikely stage for a terrifying preview of modern warfare. The setting was a soccer field adjacent to the prestigious business school, a location usually reserved for collegiate athletics and academic respite. However, the university staff had transformed the pitch into an engineering test site, digging a massive pit and flooding it with water to simulate a target environment. In the center of this artificial pond stood a solitary metal structure cradling a 70-pound bomb. The atmosphere was tense, filled with the quiet anticipation of chemists and military officers who understood that the war in the Pacific was demanding solutions that current technology could not provide. When the lead chemist, a 42-year-old professor named Louis Fischer, triggered the detonator, the result was instantaneous and horrifying. A fireball erupted, expanding with a violence that shocked even the observers who had designed the mixture. The heat was so intense, registering at over 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, the tennis players on adjacent courts scattered in sheer panic, abandoning their games as the wave of thermal energy washed over them. Across the field, naval officers observing from a nearby building were not merely startled. Several required immediate medical attention simply from inhaling the noxious, suffocating fumes that drifted from the epicenter. This was the birth of napalm, a weapon born in the Ivy League that would eventually burn the empire of Japan's fortifications from the inside out. The creation of this substance was driven by a desperate strategic necessity that had emerged in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor. By early 1942, the United States faced a grim logistical reality. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia had severed the supply lines for natural rubber. This shortage was critical not only for tires and tank treads, but for the production of existing incendiary weapons, which relied on rubber as a thickening agent for gasoline. The War Department turned to America's scientific community with an urgent mandate: create a synthetic alternative that could turn volatile liquid fuel into a stable, sticky gel. Louis Fischer, working out of the basement of the Converse Chemistry Laboratory at Harvard, took up the challenge. His team worked tirelessly, mixing and testing various compounds until, on January 29, 1942, they observed a reaction that looked promising. By combining aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate soaps, derived from specific acids with ordinary gasoline, they created a brownish, sticky syrup. It was a deceptively simple formulation, yet it possessed thermodynamic properties that were nothing short of revolutionary. They named it by combining the syllables of its key thickening agents, Na from naphtenic and Palm from palmitic. The chemistry of napalm solved the fundamental physics problem that had plagued incendiary warfare since the First World War. When pure gasoline is ignited, it burns rapidly and violently, but it consumes itself in seconds. A gasoline explosion is a flash in the pan. It creates a massive fireball that rises quickly, dispersing its heat into the air rather than transferring it to the target. For a soldier trying to destroy a wooden structure or a concrete bunker, raw gasoline was inefficient because it ran off surfaces like water and burned out before it could ignite heavy timbers or heat up the air inside a fortification. Fischer's gel changed the equation entirely. By thickening the fuel, the aluminum soap powder slowed the rate of combustion significantly. Instead of a flash, napalm burned with a slow, relentless intensity for 4 to 12 minutes. It did not splash and run. It adhered to whatever it touched, be it wood, metal, concrete, or human flesh. While standard gasoline burned at roughly 675 degrees Celsius, napalm, especially when enhanced with magnesium powder, could reach temperatures between 800 and 1,600 degrees Celsius. It was not just a fire. It was a physical substance that carried fire to a target and held it there until total destruction was achieved. This chemical breakthrough arrived just as the nature of the war in the Pacific was undergoing a fundamental and brutal shift. In the early campaigns, such as Guadalcanal, American forces had often faced the banzai charge, where Japanese troops would launch massive, suicidal frontal assaults. While terrifying, these charges depleted Japanese manpower and allowed American heavy firepower to mow down attackers in the open. However, following defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, the Japanese Imperial High Command realized that they could not match American industrial output or manpower. They changed their doctrine from offensive engagement to a strategy of attrition and defense in depth. The goal was no longer to win the war outright, but to make every inch of ground so costly in American blood that the United States would sue for a negotiated peace. To achieve this, Japanese commanders abandoned the beaches and retreated into the earth, constructing some of the most formidable defensive networks in the history of warfare. The engineering prowess displayed by the Japanese military on islands like Iwo Jima, Peleliu and Okinawa was extraordinary. On Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi oversaw the construction of 18 kilometers of interconnected tunnels. These were not mere foxholes. They were subterranean cities. The command center south of Kita Village, for instance, was a massive concrete structure 50 meters long and 20 meters wide, buried under 20 meters of solid rock and accessible only through a 150-meter tunnel. These chambers were ventilated, electrified, and stocked with food and ammunition to last 4 months. A full quarter of the island's 22,000-man garrison was dedicated solely to digging. On Peleliu, the defenders utilized the natural geology of the Immerbergl ridges, a landscape of jagged limestone that was harder than concrete. They hollowed out over 500 natural caves, turning them into mutually supporting pillbox. These positions were masterpieces of defensive architecture. Entrances were slanted to deflect incoming grenades and flamethrower bursts. Armored steel doors protected the occupants, and multiple exits allowed defenders to escape, circle back, and re-engage American Marines from the rear. Against this new style of fortification, the conventional American arsenal proved shockingly ineffective. The prelude to the invasion of Iwo Jima involved weeks of aerial bombardment followed by the heaviest pre-landing naval shelling of the war. Battleships and cruisers hurled thousands of tons of high explosives onto an island that measured only 8 square miles. To the observers offshore, the island appeared to be pulverized, a churning mass of dust and smoke where nothing could possibly survive. Major General Wilbert Brown, watching the cataclysm, famously remarked that he believed no living thing could exist in that inferno. Yet, when the Marines hit the beaches, the Japanese were there, largely unscathed, waiting underground. High explosive shells detonated on the surface, shattering rock and tossing dirt. But the shock waves could not penetrate the meters of limestone and concrete protecting the defenders. War Department reports from 1943 had already begun to document the frustration. Grenades thrown into dugouts were often thrown back, or the explosion was absorbed by the complex geometry of the tunnels. Positions that were blasted, burned with gasoline, and sealed with bulldozers would inexplicably come back to life days later. As Japanese troops dug themselves out or utilized secret escape tunnels to reoccupy the ruins, it became clear to American commanders that they needed a weapon capable of reaching around corners. A weapon that could flow like a liquid but destroy like a heavy munition. They needed napalm. The substance first appeared in the field in late 1943. But its true tactical value was realized when it was paired with the M4 Sherman tank. While portable backpack-mounted flamethrowers were effective, they were essentially suicide weapons for the operators. A soldier carrying a flamethrower had to close within 20 yards of a pillbox, standing upright to aim, carrying highly flammable fuel on his back while being the priority target for every Japanese sniper in the vicinity. The casualty rates for these men were appalling. The introduction of the flame tank, specifically the Sherman equipped with the Navy Mark I flamethrower, changed the dynamic of the assault. These 70-ton beasts could approach fortifications, with immunity to small arms fire and unleash a stream of thickened napalm out to 80 yards. Difference in performance between raw gasoline and napalm in these tank-mounted weapons was the difference between harassment and annihilation. When a tank fired a stream of unthickened gasoline, the fuel would atomize as it left the barrel, creating a large, rolling ball of fire that looked impressive, but dissipated its energy quickly. Only about 10% of the fuel would actually enter a small aperture, like a bunker firing slit at 20 yards. Napalm, however, left the barrel as a tight, cohesive rod of jelly. It did not break up in the air. It could be skipped off the ground like a stone across a pond, ricocheting off hard surfaces to bounce into caves or trenches. At 50 yards, nearly half of the napalm charge would successfully enter a pit. Once inside, the gel did not merely burn the occupants. It adhered to the walls and ceiling, turning the bunker into an oven that maintained lethal temperatures for minutes rather than seconds. However, the lethality of napalm against the Japanese tunnel systems went beyond thermal burns. The science of the weapon introduced a terrifying new method of killing: asphyxiation. When napalm burns in a confined space, it consumes oxygen at a voracious rate. A single burst into a cave mouth could suck the breathable air out of a complex tunnel system hundreds of feet deep. Simultaneously, the incomplete combustion of the carbon-heavy gel produced massive amounts of carbon monoxide. American Marines quickly learned to exploit this. At Peleliu and Okinawa, they developed a technique where they would pump unlit napalm into a cave, allowing the sticky fluid to flow down into the depths and coat the lower chambers. The volatile vapors would build up, filling the darkness with explosive gas. Then, a single white phosphorus grenade would be tossed in. The resulting detonation would ignite the entire system instantly, consuming all oxygen and collapsing the lungs of defenders, who were hiding deep enough to escape the direct flames. The interconnected nature of the Japanese defenses, which had been their greatest strength against high explosives, became their fatal weakness against napalm. A conventional shell hitting one bunker would only destroy that specific bunker, but because the tunnels were linked for ventilation and movement, fire and toxic gas introduced at one point could travel throughout the network. At Okinawa, tank crews reported pumping phosphorus smoke shells into a single cave entrance, and watching in astonishment as smoke began to billow from 30 other hidden openings across the hillside. This confirmed that the napalm they were about to fire would not just neutralize the entrance, but would likely kill everyone in the complex. The corkscrew and blowtorch method became the standard operating procedure. Use explosives to blast open the cave mouth, the corkscrew, and then unleash the napalm, the blowtorch to scour the interior. The impact of this weapon on the Japanese defenders was profound and arguably exceeded the physical destruction. Post-war interrogations and captured diaries revealed a deep, primal terror of the flamethrower that existed for no other American weapon. Japanese soldiers, who were culturally indoctrinated to accept death from bullets or shrapnel as an honorable consequence of war, viewed incineration as a barbarous horror. Contemporary chemical warfare bulletins noted that Japanese newspapers described the flamethrowers as inhumane instruments of torture. This fear altered the behavior of the defenders. In some rare instances, the mere rumble of a flame tank approaching a position was enough to cause Japanese troops who almost never surrendered to emerge with their hands up. Far more often, however, the approach of the flame tanks triggered a wave of suicides inside the bunkers. Defenders chose to pull the pins on their own grenades rather than face the liquid fire. The American troops who utilized these weapons were not immune to the horror of what they were doing. The moral weight of deploying napalm pressed heavily on the Marines. Eugene Sledge, a mortarman whose memoir With the Old Breed provides one of the most visceral accounts of the Pacific War, articulated this internal conflict. He noted that while shooting an enemy with a rifle was a grim necessity, frying him to death was a concept too gruesome to contemplate. Yet, Sledge also admitted the terrible truth that every Marine eventually accepted. The Japanese could not be routed from their defenses without it. The alternative to napalm was not a cleaner war. It was a longer war involving close-quarters hand-to-hand combat in the dark, with vastly higher American casualties. Medal of Honor recipient Herschel Woody Williams, who operated a flamethrower on Iwo Jima for 4 hours, destroying 7 pillboxes, became a hero not because he enjoyed the killing, but because his actions saved the lives of his fellow Marines, who were pinned down by the relentless machine gun fire from those bunkers. The scale of napalm's deployment grew exponentially as the sheer effectiveness of the weapon became undeniable. By the time of the invasion of Okinawa, the U.S. Army had converted an entire battalion, the 713th, into a specialized flame tank unit comprising 54 vehicles. During that campaign alone, they consumed over 200,000 gallons of napalm. The after-action reports were staggering. The 96th Infantry Division documented that flame weapons had sealed 273 caves and destroyed 317 pillboxes. In the Philippines, the usage escalated to aerial delivery, with American aircraft dropping more than 1 million gallons of napalm in tactical support of ground troops. By the end of the war, the United States military was consuming 75 million pounds of napalm annually. The 2/3 of this production that was sent to the Pacific Theater became the primary tool for dismantling the Empire's defensive strategy. This tactical evolution eventually reached its logical and terrifying conclusion in the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The properties that made napalm effective against caves, its ability to stick and burn at high temperatures, made it devastating against Japanese cities, which were constructed largely of wood and paper. On the night of March 9, 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched Operation Meat. 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers flew over Tokyo, dropping over 1,600 tons of incendiary clusters, many packed with the same gelled gasoline formula Louis Fieser had developed. The result was a firestorm of apocalyptic proportions. The napalm created a conflagration that sucked the oxygen out of the atmosphere, creating superheated winds that snapped trees and boiled canals. Temperatures in the target zone reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. In a single night, nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo were incinerated, and an estimated 100,000 people perished, a death toll that exceeded the immediate casualties of either the Hiroshima or Nagasaki atomic bombings. The trajectory of napalm from a chemistry experiment on a Harvard soccer field to the primary instrument of destruction in the Pacific War is a testament to the ruthless efficiency of military engineering. Louis Fieser, the man who started it all, remained largely detached from the moral implications of his invention. In later years, he stated simply that he had no right to judge the morality of napalm just because he had created it, claiming he could not have foreseen how military planners would utilize his formula. This claim of ignorance is complicated by the fact that his team's testing included the construction of replica Japanese villages, complete with authentic tatami mats and children's toys, to measure the burn characteristics specifically against civilian-style structures. Fieser's detachment stands in stark contrast to the experiences of the men on the ground, who saw the effects up close. Ultimately, napalm changed the arithmetic of the Pacific War. Before its introduction, the United States faced a stalemate against a dug-in enemy that could seemingly survive any amount of conventional high explosives. The caves of Iwo Jima and the ridges of Peleliu were designed to bleed the American military dry, to make the cost of conquest so high that the American public would lose the will to fight. Napalm negated that strategy. It provided a solution that flowed like water, burned like the sun, and killed where bullets could not reach. It transformed the battlefield from a contest of infantry assaults into a systematic process of chemical destruction. American engineers had achieved what years of naval bombardment could not. They found a way to reach the enemy behind their walls of stone. The method was horrific, the results were undeniable, and the weapon that burned the Japanese fortresses from the inside out would cast a long, dark shadow over the history of warfare, leaving a legacy of ethical debate that continues to this day.